As we wait to get started, I guess you can enjoy this photo of a few residents of the Dawson region. These are two caribou from the 40-mile herd, and our campaigns coordinator, Malcolm Boothroyd, took this photo a few years ago when he went and visited their range. And we've got, wrote a great story on this trip for the Narwhal, so you can actually check that out. I think Adil, our communications manager, is going to pop that link into the chat if you want to take a look at that story. It's a great read over coffee in the morning. I'm going to try not to look up at the blinding light that I've got in front of me. I think I looked a little bit like the Godfather last presentation I was in, so I've tried to have a better lighting situation. Well, I think we might as well just jump right into it. Thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Randi Newton and I'm the conservation manager for CPAWS Yukon. I've been really fortunate to be with the organization for just about 5 years now. Tonight I'm joining you from the traditional territory of Kwanlindun First Nation and the Tongkwachin Council. And it's just a really nice way to ground our evening and think about the traditional territory that we're on, because the plan that we're talking about, the Dawson Region plan, is embedded within the traditional territory and the final agreement, the modern treaty of Tongkwachin First Nation, or Tongkwachin. And this plan covers about 75% of their traditional territory and also includes the territories of the First Nation of Natchinagdun, Tongkwachin, and White River. And a little bit about CPAWS. Our mission is to advocate for the territory's wild spaces, recognizing these really deep interconnections between us and the land. And so as a conservation organization, we make sure that our actions are grounded in a commitment to reconciliation. That's something we really carry to heart. And I'd also like to introduce my co-presenter for the evening. You can see on screen, Sebastian Jones. He is with Yukon Conservation Society. He is their fish, wildlife, and habitat analyst. Sebastian, I don't know if you want to introduce yourself. I see you there.
I'll introduce myself when I start my presentation.
Sounds good. YCS has been in the Yukon since 1968. They pursue ecosystem well-being throughout the Yukon and beyond. And I feel really fortunate to get to collaborate with YCS and count Sebastian and the team as really close colleagues. So this is quite fun to do. Just a couple things before we dive in. We're recording this presentation, so if you have to take off a little bit early, don't worry, you can head to our websites and there'll be a recording there, or you can head to Facebook and you'll also find a recording. And then if you'd like, Zoom has a live transcript or a closed captioning feature, so you should be able to find that on your screen if you want to have some text as you listen. I know I often do that while I'm trying to watch something on TV. Zoom creates these on the fly though, so I'm not sure about the accuracy. So we've got a couple of goals for this evening. I think our first goal is really to share some perspectives on how this recommended plan could be made stronger so it could better protect the region's ecological and cultural values. And then we're going to shift into, well, having a bit of a mind blank. I haven't done a webinar for about a year. Okay. We're going to shift into talking about the region's ecological and cultural values. And then sort of the second goal is when we talk about this, hoping you leave with enough information to feel empowered to provide your feedback on the plan. And this plan is going to shape the health of the region for decades to come. And it really gains strength through the voices of the many people who contribute. So I do hope you'll take the time to send in your thoughts. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about the region, where we're at in the planning process, where we're heading to, and then I'm going to talk a little bit more about the plan and how we can build on what's already in it. Sebastian is then going to take over and share his perspectives on how creating a plan for caribou is really a way to create a plan that's good for the entire region. I'm going to come back on screen and talk a little bit about the public engagement and how you can share your voice, the different avenues for that. The recommendations I'm going to touch on in my presentation, CPAWS has turned into an editable template letter that if what you hear tonight resonates with you, you are free to make any changes to that letter that you wish and send that in if that's how you want to participate, but I'll speak to that later on. And finally, we're going to finish our evening with a Q&A. So that'll be your chance to get any clarification that you're looking for. You can send in your thoughts. We'd love to hear them. And so that will be facilitated by Martin Melendro, and he is Yukon Conservation Society's new executive director. I think this is sort of his public Yukon debut. So welcome, Martin. I will give him a proper introduction at the end. And there's going to be a couple ways to participate in that Q&A. So if you have a thought or a question and that comes up anytime, pop it into the chat, we'll get to it. Or if you would rather ask it yourself, we can unmute you later on and you can be part of the conversation. So might as well jump right into it then. Looking at the screen in blue here, we have the Dawson region, and it covers about 10% of the Yukon. And zooming in a little bit more, just to orient you if you need that, sort of that northeastern edge, that's where the Peel watershed falls. You can't really see it, but that southeastern edge is bounded by the Stewart River. We've got the Yukon River running through the region. You can see below Dawson City, there's that figure 8 Goldfields Road. And so the land that the region, this community that the region really centers around is Dawson City. And so the plan doesn't actually include Dawson City. It doesn't have policies or zoning that relates to this community, but it is the community of the region. And I think that's one thing that really sets us apart from the Peel. There's a community within the region, and there's already quite a bit of industrial development that exists on the ground. And I think it is very true that a lot of that mining activity is here to stay, and it's an important part of people's livelihoods. So a major component of this plan is saying, okay, we have these regions, there is development. How can we still develop policies and put limits on development so we can steward this region the best that we can? And that's really about managing cumulative effects. But I'm not really going to touch on that much in this presentation because with the time I have, I want to focus on the areas of this region where the values are too high and the risks are too much that industrial development will eat away at what people value so much about this landscape. Because we know it's been tried in other places. I grew up in Alberta. I know there's probably people from BC or these other more industrial landscapes where they've made efforts to say that we can have development in wildlife, but we've seen wildlife decline, and then the ways of life that are attached to these landscapes become lost. And the values on this landscape are immense. It is the home of Trondequitchin, people who have lived on this landscape for thousands of years since time immemorial. We've got the 40 Mile Caribou herd, like I was talking about. We've got the Clear Creek herd and the Heart River herd along the Dempster region. We've got grizzly bears and wolverines and rougher years for salmon lately, but still people hope to support and see their recovery. And so just these immense ecological and cultural values. So before we head into the plan, I want to touch on where we're at in the planning process. And so we kind of know what's coming next. And so all regional plans in the Yukon, they are embedded in the umbrella final agreement. That's where they flow from. That's what gives the framework. And this plan in particular flows from Trondequitchin's final agreement, like I said. It's actually quite incredible that we have an opportunity, that a modern treaty has provided an opportunity for people to share their voice and the future that they want to see for a landscape. That's an opportunity most places and most people don't get. And it's actually something that's quite profound, I would say. But I think along with that comes a responsibility to uphold the integrity of the final agreement and the goals within it. And so last summer, maybe you tuned into some of the webinars or you took part, the draft plan came out. And it was created by an independent 6-person commission of longtime local regional residents. They were also created this recommended plan, and they are supported by a planning team. And I just want to say, I do have the utmost respect for that planning commission. There was a lot of thought that went into the draft plan and the recommended plan. I think the recommended plan is quite a thoughtful document, even if obviously we're going to talk about suggestions to strengthen it. But what I saw is the commission made themselves really available at public engagement, at workshops to to listen, to ask really engaged questions, to have back and forth, pretty challenging discussions. And there's some pretty key changes from the draft plan to this plan, and I have a lot of respect for that. So last time when the draft came out, I think my message was generally, we can make this plan stronger. But my message now, I've got a little tweak to it because the context now is different. Because instead of speaking directly to the commission, this time around, we're speaking to Yukon government and Trondequitchin. And in turn, they're going to take what they've heard and turn it into recommendations for the commission, or they're going to filter in a way what they've heard. And so the power has shifted in a way from the commission to these parties. And I guess I just want to say, before I worked for CPAWS, I worked as a land use planner, and I stopped doing that because I got frustrated. Time and time again, I would work on plans and they would get weaker and weaker and weaker every time a colonial government stepped in, when the power shifted to a colonial government. Do I know that will happen this time? No, I don't know. But with that in the back of my mind, my message is this time, I think, yes, we can make the plan stronger, but we also need to push decision makers to hold steadfast to the parts of the plan that are already strong and forward-looking, and not get stuck settling on short-term interest or going backwards. So this plan, this recommended plan, there's a small chance this will be the final stage of this process, but that's doubtful. Trondequitchin and Yukon government can both propose changes, and we're very likely going to end up with a final recommended plan. Engagement closes on December 20th. We've got a 30-day extension. So I still encourage you not to delay in putting in your comments, but take the time that you need. I'm just going to dive right into the recommended plan. So I know there's two maps on the screen, so don't panic. We're going to kind of go through this step by step, and I'm going to bring these forward again and again and help you orient to what you're seeing. Just to give a really quick 20-second overview. The green areas on each map, they are our conservation areas. And so in the draft that came out last year, you can see a few different colors of green. And those bright green, those vibrant green areas, those were kind of the full-fledged conservation areas that you think of. And those olive green areas, they were part of this sort of two-tier conservation system. They had weaker protections. So mining and other developments were withdrawn, but they didn't have any framework in place for active stewardship or active management or tools in place for Trondequitchin to co-manage their traditional lands. And so it was just a confusing process. And so that was scrapped. And so that's why you look at the recommended plan, and the green are intended to become full-fledged protected areas. Then if you look at the other colored areas, the red, the yellow, those are areas that are open for development. So red is the lowest levels of development, then you move up to orange, then yellow, and then you move up to beige, where the highest levels of development are allowed. And that makes sense. The beige is the gold field. So that's why it's colored in that way. And so I guess one way to think of these plans is the draft plan is where we've been, and the recommended plan is where we're at. And I think the question is, so what map shows where we can go? And I've been thinking a lot about what that map could look like. I'm sure actually a lot of people here have been thinking about that map. And what I'll try to do tonight is bring forward a collective knowledge based on conversations with folks in other organizations, people in the region, people in governments, conservation science, and do my best to bring that forward. But even with that, I don't think I could do the future of the region justice. And that's, I think, the simplest way to explain the feeling that I have about that is this quote. This is from Louise Prophet LeBlanc. She's a First Nation of Natchez citizen, a writer, a storyteller. And she said this in a forum in the 90s on Northern protected areas. This land has been traversed for countless millennium, and it speaks in a language that is only totally understood by the aged. And so that's why one of the North Stars I've turned to when thinking of where this plan should go is the conservation priorities that were put forward by Trondequitchin, because woven into those conservation priorities is a collective knowledge and understanding of the land that I just can't bring forward on my own. And so this is the map that I turn to again and again as I think about the future of the region. And this is a map that Toronto presented in 2020 to the Planning Commission of their conservation priorities. And we'll put a link in the chat to where you can find this map and the documents that go alongside it. I guess I can't say that this map, is the final word. Some of these priorities may have shifted as Toronto engages more with their citizens and, what's on the ground shifts. But this is still a really helpful foundation for me to turn to. Because layered into this map is the value of water and waterways and habitat for fish and wildlife, the importance of ecological connectivity and integrity. But then there's things that I personally can't bring forward, but I think are very important to echo. And that's things like cultural continuity and the land as a cultural landscape, land that has all of these things woven into it of songs and stories and place names and kinship relations and these traditional trails and these trap lines. And it's all quite meaningful. And so in the document that accompanies this map, Toronto talks about that protecting and conserving these areas is a way to contribute to upholding the rights under the Toronto Final Agreement. But it's also good for conservation. It's also good for reconciliation, for quality of life, recreation, tourism, well-being, economic diversification. And so I guess without further ado, and with this map in the back of our minds, I'm going to go over 6 key recommendations that I think bringing forward will help us strengthen this plan, help it align better with this map and this future, and so we can pass on this healthy future to generations upon generations. So with each recommendation I go into, I'm going to start us off with a map, just so we can kind of orient ourselves in space. And I'm going to start by taking us to the Masson uplands in the core range of the 40-mile caribou herd, and their key migratory range. So if you look at this map, it actually looks pretty similar, but you can see that the protected area, that area in green, it's gotten a little bit larger. I know Sebastian is going to talk about how that green needs to extend up farther and farther down. But there's actually been a major change from the draft to the recommended plan, a major positive change that you can't tell from looking at this map. And it's that within the plan, the Commission has said no hard rock mining is envisioned in this orange area, number 21. And the reason they said that in the plan and put that forward was a way to protect the herd's alpine habitat, the alpine areas that they rely on for travel and for food and for refuge from bugs. And we know that study after study shows that advanced hard rock mining and exploration and road building is bad news for caribou. Caribou lose out every time. But if you look at that map, you can see there's a pretty obvious pinch point. We have this yellow arm extending into this orange zone. And that yellow arm has higher levels of development that are permitted, and hard rock mining is permitted. And I don't know for certain, but I suspect the reason the map is drawn this way, and this is a little in the weeds, but I think it's worth thinking through, is because that yellow area is along the 60-mile river, and there's quite a bit of placer mining activity there. And there's enough placer mining activity there to the extent that it would exceed the amount of development that's allowed in an orange area. So perhaps the Commission felt a little bit stuck, like, well, we can't really make this area orange. I guess it's stuck in yellow. What can we do? But I think the solution could be pretty simple, and the plan could just say no hard rock mining in the core range of the herd. And in planning lingo, you would just call that an overlay. So this is the situation that we've translated into this kind of simple recommendation, which is to prioritize the herd's habitat over access to minerals. This is a herd that once numbered, over 250,000 animals. It has rebounded and crashed. It reached a low in the 1970s of about 6,000 animals. It still yo-yos a bit between 40 and 80,000, somewhere around there. But there have been decades of concerted recovery efforts. And this plan can really honor those efforts by making sure this herd has an enduring and safe home to return to. So now moving on, I'm going to take you to some of the region's wetland areas. I haven't circled them all on this map, but the recommended plan has actually boosted protections for some areas. If you look at the southwestern corner, it's 22 on the draft plan and 20 on the recommended, that's the Scotty Creek wetlands. And in the draft, it had that weak protection, but in this plan, it's been boosted to that full-fledged protected area. There's also now protections for the Flat Creek wetlands. If you look to that green area that's kind of bisected by the orange oval, those are the Flat Creek wetlands that are now protected. But protections have weakened for some areas. And if you look at that orange circle, that's the Indian River watershed. And the blue line is the Indian River running through. And the upper Indian River watershed is that the once green area that's now shifted to orange. And so it's a once protected area that is now shifted to being open to development. And this is a place, the Indian River watershed, that is a hotspot of placer mining activity. And it's also a hotspot of disagreement about the future of that region. This watershed, I think it's very true. It has provided a lot of economic benefit to some people and employment to some people and wellness to some people, but it's also come at the expense of other things. Other values like carbon storage, and CPAWS will soon be releasing a report looking at the magnitude of that potential carbon release. It's come at the expense of intact landscapes and intact ecosystems, and at the expense of traditional connections to the land. And I think that's why Trondikwichen and others, including CPAWS and Yukon Conservation Society, have pushed for many years to put a pause on mining in this landscape, but it has continued marching forward. So this is a quote from a Trondikwichen citizen that was made at the Yukon Water Board hearing on placer mining and wetlands. And the Indian River Valley that exists today is much different than the broad sweeping wetland habitat it used to be. With the increase in activity and lack of reclamation and destroyed habitat, I don't feel as comfortable with harvesting down there anymore. I don't even want to drive down there for leisure. I find it depressing because I see a loss from all the change, including the loss of my ability to have a successful harvest. And this quote that I'm reading to you is from the Water Board hearing, but it was actually included in the recommended plan. It was included in the section that speaks to the upper Indian River watershed. And I think there's a pretty extreme dissonance between this sentiment and the policies that are allowed in the recommended plan. And so that's taken us to this recommendation. While it's true that many of the watershed's wetlands have been lost, it's not too late to protect the ones that remain, including the entirety of the upper watershed. Would this be complex? Yes. In the upper watershed, there are claims that would need to be dealt with, whether they're relinquished or bought out or something. But given the efforts that so many people have gone to protect this landscape, particularly the upper watershed that's so critical for these water connections, and the efforts that Trondikwichen has gone to, and that this plan is being conducted under their final agreement, I think this is complexity that needs to be waded through. Meaningful reconciliation doesn't always feel simple. Now I'm going to bring us to two different landscapes, Antimony in the north and the White River landscape of the south. And these are landscapes that are deserving of additional protections. And Sebastian is going to speak to these, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. But you can actually see in the north that protections for the Antimony landscape so it's gone from green in the draft to red in the recommended plan, open for development. Protections have been walked back. But it's incredible habitat for Dall sheep. It's the home of grizzlies and caribou, and the plan mentions the deep cultural connections to this landscape and that sense of entering Dempster country and leaving those traces of mining behind and entering that place where traditional pursuits are that much closer. But of course, there's mining claims, quite significant mining claims in that landscape. And so that, I think, has created a hesitancy to protect that landscape. Looking at the south, that White River landscape, it's home to the White and Ladue rivers, really amazing wetland complexes, this rolling plateau terrain. And it's one of our last chances to protect the Klondike Plateau ecoregion. which is a goal of Yukon protected area legislation, but also just a good idea in general. And I know the term ecoregion can sound really jargony, but really it's just a way to talk about the diverse landscapes that make up the Yukon. And I think of them as nature's neighborhoods. And so by making sure that we protect a meaningful portion of each of the Yukon's diverse landscapes, we can pass on that same diversity to future generations of people and wild creatures. And so that's why we have this recommendation to expand protection that are missing for lands that are critical for wildlife and traditional pursuits. Finally, our next two recommendations deal with water and salmon. And you can see many of the waterways that I've already spoken to in this region, the Yukon, the Stewart, the Klondike, the White. There's many smaller on here that you can't see. I think the power and importance of water is quite intuitive. It underpins healthy ecosystems, cultural connections. People rely on these waterways for moose hunting and passing on that knowledge, and their paddling trips. People rely on it for their livelihoods and their ecotourism businesses. And as Trondikwichen said in their input to the commission, water is the life force of all creation and our collective survival depends on it. And they have mentioned that protecting major waterways is a critical way to uphold the final agreement. And so the region's waterways deserve special status. For some rivers, that might mean an overlay where some types of development or minimal development is still allowed, but maybe there's stronger rules. But for other rivers like the Yukon River, I think a high order of protection is warranted. And the draft plan had previously identified the Yukon River as a conservation area, although it did say that it would be planned in the future through sub-regional planning. The recommended plan has walked that back a little bit and said, we actually haven't designated the Yukon River as anything. We'll figure it out in the future through sub-regional planning. But the plan still points to this extreme importance of the river for so many reasons. And it even mentions exploring legal personhood for the river. And I think there's a risk in not designating this river through this plan, of waiting for sub-regional planning. Because this plan, it's going to take a lot to implement. It's quite a complex plan. It's going to take a lot of resources and capacity and time of both governments and other organizations. And so I would urge decision makers, rather than pushing this decision down the road of, are we protecting the river, are we not, to give it a conservation designation now, figure out the details of how some development and barging can be accommodated, because there are some industrial uses along the river, accommodate them through zoning and management planning, because this is really our chance. And similar to water, salmon are the foundation for some of the region's most important ecological and cultural systems. I know runs have been really bleak in recent years, quite depressing, but I think there are things we can do to support the salmon who do make it here. And we know there's a few simple things that salmon need. They need clean water and they need good quality habitat. So we can make sure they have clean water by monitoring water quality. And in areas where we see it declining or are worried about it declining, we can put a halt on development. We can change our practices. And we can also make sure we're not losing critical habitat like rearing and spawning areas by requiring mapping ahead of development, so that we're not accidentally losing those areas that are so important. You know, the few salmon who make it here, they need their spawning grounds, and the next generation needs a really good start. I think that brings me to our final and in a way, the most foundational recommendation. And the motto of this entire planning process, which I quite love, is on the land we walk together. And I've heard this again and again, and I think people involved have taken this really to heart. But one of the best ways to ensure that decision makers and Trondikwichen and Yukon government continue to do this is to ensure that there's clear language in the plan that it's going to be jointly implemented. There's really clear language in the appeal plan that it'll be jointly implemented, but the language in this plan is a little bit less consistent and it's less strong. But the Supreme Court case on the Peel watershed it made it really clear that the final agreements and land use planning are intended to renew the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Crown to one of equal partnership. And they're intended to advance reconciliation. And we can really honor those principles and that plan's motto through joint implementation. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sebastian. I'll be back after Sebastian has presented to speak about how you can share your voice.
Thank you, Randi. Okay, I'll dive right into things and share my screen. Now I can't reach it. Why not? Oh, sorry. This is. Okay. Sorry about that. Good evening. My name's Sebastian Jones, and I am the Fish, Wildlife, and Habitat Analyst for the Yukon Conservation Society, and I am speaking to you tonight from my home in the lands of the Trandegwitchen, where I've had the privilege of living for most of my life. Tonight, I'm going to quickly walk us through the recommended plan and show that while it does achieve some bold and visionary milestones, it can still do some more work to achieve true sustainability. And it's my hope that you'll come away from tonight better equipped to comment on the plan. I expect that most Yukoners are familiar with the words on this slide. But because this webinar could potentially reach people from outside the world, around the world, I'm going to give a really brief rundown of the context to this land use plan. So most of the older treaties in Canada do not provide for self-government. They confined band authority to reserves. Yukon treaties are very different, not perfect, but by most measures, they're much better. Not only do these agreements empower First Nation citizens, they empower ordinary Yukon residents as well. They provide us, people like you and I, with real input into processes such as land use plans, environmental assessments, fish and wildlife management plans. It's why we're here this evening. Most of the Yukon is divided into planning regions based on the traditional territories of the First Nations. When the agreements were signed, it was assumed by many that these land use plans would be one of the very first provisions to be implemented, but it turned out that it was much harder and much slower to complete these plans than was expected. After 25 years, we're approaching the end of this third region to have a plan after the North Yukon and the Peel. Again, for those not so familiar with the planning region, here is where the Dawson planning region sits compared to some of the other regions in the Yukon. So here's the Peel watershed, here's the Dawson planning region. This is the Northern Shoshone planning region based on the communities of Nacho-Nayak-Dan, Selkirk First Nation, and Little Salmon Carmacks First Nation. And this may be the next planning region, but we don't know yet for sure. And this is the part of the Trandegwitchen territory that's being planned for. Regional land use plans come from the treaties, the final agreements. The land use plan is intended for all the treaties, as it was originally thought that land use plans would be one of the very first parts of the plans of treaties that were implemented. The thing to remember is that planning is hard. So what do we see here? We can see Dawson City, the major rivers, and the different colors, which indicate different levels of land use, which, as Randi explained, take us all the way from fully protected to partially protected to the most open areas. Special management areas are protected areas, and they count towards Canada's HE targets of 25% protection by the year 2025 and 30% protection by 2030. Canada is currently at 13%. So we really have only got 3 years in Canada to identify a whole schwack of additional protected areas to meet our milestone on our way to 30% by 2030. The recommended plan shows about 34% protected, which doesn't seem too bad, does it? Well, maybe. But, okay, I want to talk about caribou. And I want to talk about caribou because caribou are amazing creatures that have been roamed the north for over 2 million years. They're central to the life and culture of Indigenous people, and they're rapidly vanishing as a result of human disturbance. And there are some really important things that we need to know about caribou and how they fit into land use planning. The first one is that caribou are an indicator of ecosystem health. What that means is that where we have healthy caribou herds, we can be pretty certain that we also have healthy ecosystems. When we protect caribou, we shelter numerous other species under the umbrella of their protection. So what that means is that if we create a plan that is centered around caribou, we shall have a plan that is good for the environment and good for people to exist on the land for thousands of more years. And what is a plan, if not a kind of a legacy for the future? Caribou are, in fact, identified as a central value in the recommended Dawson Regional Land Use Plan, and this map shows us why. It shows the 6 different caribou herds that range over the Dawson Planning Region. This here is the Nalchina herd. It's a migratory woodland herd that spends most of its time in Alaska, but it also ranges into the planning region. Last winter, this was the caribou herd that showed up in the Dawson region in the wintertime. The one that Randi mentioned that we think of often in the planning region is the 40-mile caribou herd. And this is the area that's illustrated here. But remember that it used to range all the way as far as Whitehorse. We also have the porcupine caribou herd that ranges down from the north. We have the Heart River herd centered around Tombstone Park. We also have the Clear Creek herd centered around Clear Creek, right on the edge of the planning region. And finally, right down near the Coffee Creek mine area, we have the Claza herd. The point is that the entire planning region is caribou country, and once upon a time, countless hundreds of thousands of caribou roamed across this land. So I showed you a map of the recommended plan. You've seen this, the current vision of the Planning Commission, and we don't think it quite protects caribou and the wild species they depend upon adequately. Now I'm going to go on and show you 2 more visions, one from the Yukon government and one from the Trandikwachen government. This vision was the one that was supplied by the government of the Yukon when the planning process first started. It's the sister map to this one that was supplied by the Trandikwachen government, the one that Randi spoke about earlier. The Yukon government one works out to about 12% protection, and this one works out to closer to 60%. Remember that the recommended plan sets aside about 34% protection, which on the face of it, seems like kind of in between, might seem like a pretty smart compromise, but it's not really focused on caribou. So we don't think it really achieves what the plan's goals are. So here's the map that's supplied with the recommended plan. What we'd like to see is we'd like to be able to see connected protected areas that allow for caribou to migrate and to range over and to graze and to utilize their summer range. And it's almost got it right on this plan. But if we just did things just a little bit different, we could color a lot more of it green. So what we're proposing is that this 40-mile caribou corridor land management unit become a protected area. The White River area become also a caribou conservation area. And in addition, this one here, the antimony area. This one here, when you read the language in the plan, it just shouts conservation all over it. I think it's a very easy step to make it into a protected area. But there's other big issues with the plan, even in areas that are specially designated for protection. And what I want to show you here is a protected area. And I call this upside down planning. This slide shows a protected area. It aims to protect critical summer range and migration pathways for the 40-mile caribou herd. This is where it is in the planning region. But we can see this strange jagged outlines on one side of it. Can you guess why? It's because chunks were taken out of this protected area to accommodate mining claims. So what this tells us is that even protected areas are actually managed for human activities, managed to allow for human activities, and that the human economy takes precedence over caribou, even in protected areas. And so that's why the plan doesn't really quite achieve sustainability, because it focuses too much on human activity and future human activity at the expense of caribou. But we don't just prioritize mining over caribou. We actually give mining space to expand. The non-protected areas in the planning region, the integrated stewardship areas, means that although a certain level of industrial activity, the planners want us to hold the concept of stewardship to our hearts. However, the thresholds of human-caused disturbance that apply to the various levels of the integrated stewardship areas are not based upon the needs of caribou. They're actually based upon the needs of humans and mostly the needs of mining. And this is a bit different from the previous plans. So what they did was they looked at the current disturbance footprint, added it all up, and then ran a scenario forward about 20 years over either a high development scenario or a lower development scenario that would indicate how much of the land should be set aside for industrial development. And that's how they set these thresholds. And in many parts of the planning region, this level would have severe adverse consequences for caribou, and basically they'd be pushed out. The point is that in no part of the planning, no integrated stewardship area, do we have a plan for a reduction in anthropogenic footprint, even where we've already displaced caribou, so we can bring them back. So what I'm encouraging you to do is to ask the Commission to modify the parties, to ask the Commission to modify the recommended plan and paint this map greener for caribou, similar to the vision for the Trandikvichin. And that brings us to the end of my presentation.
All right, I will bring mine up as I talk about now that you've heard this, how you can be engaged. And then after I talk about this, we'll get into the Q&A. Okay, thought maybe this is a good way to link between what I'm going to talk about and what Sebastian just talked about. But before I get into exactly what's on the slide, I just want to thank everyone for tuning in tonight and listening. And I hope that you come away feeling empowered or with enough information to provide that feedback. You know, as I said earlier, we're really fortunate that the final agreements give us this opportunity to share our voice. But the reason I wanted to bring this up is we're fortunate, unlike so many other places in the world, that we have an opportunity to steward and pass on to future generations what's been lost in so many other places. And so I look at this passage from Together Today for Our Children Tomorrow, and it's a really foundational document that came before the final agreements. And it speaks to not letting what happened to the buffalo, not let this happen to the caribou. And I think that sentiment about caribou can be expanded to so many other values that are still remaining on the landscape today. And so just as we have this opportunity to share our voice, I think we also have a responsibility. And we have a responsibility both to upholding the final agreement that this plan comes from, and we have a responsibility to the land. And the land takes care of us. And by sharing your feedback on this plan, it is a very tangible way that you can look after the land. And so there's a few ways that you can provide your input, and I'm going to call them good, better, best. And I'll start with the best. And that is, you can head to the website. This is the official engagement website on the Land We Walk Together. And Adele is going to throw that link into our chat. And you can take this detailed survey and provide really in-depth information to the parties and to the Planning Commission and to decision makers. This might feel a little bit intimidating though, or maybe you don't have the time to do this, or you just don't know quite where to get started. So that's when you head to the good and the better options. And so CPAWS, we have taken all of the recommendations that I talked about tonight and put them into a fully editable letter. And it starts off with this commitment to the conservation priorities identified by Trundle-Gwitchin. And I think if these recommendations that you read in the letter fully resonate with you, then there's nothing wrong with sending that in. I know there's been issues that I've cared about, but I just didn't have the time or couldn't figure out how to translate what I wanted to say into, the right words. So I did something similar to this. So this is the good option. And then the better option is to take this letter and to edit it and to talk about why this region matters to you, what compelled you to write in, to add your own recommendations. If there's anything in here you don't quite understand, give me a call or send me an email. I'm sure Sebastian would extend the same invitation. And like I said, the deadline for comments is December 20th. Although I encourage you to send them in as soon as you're ready, as soon as you feel able. For folks who are in Whitehorse, there is an open house next week, November 16th. Again, all that info is on the official website on the Land We Walk Together. I plan to visit and I hope to see you there. And I've heard that there's going to be another open house in Dawson City. I don't know if the dates have been set for that yet, but you can stay tuned. But with that, I think it's time to turn it over to everyone who's here. And if you've got a question or even a comment, there's a couple things you can throw that question or comment into the chat. If you would rather say it out yourself, we can just unmute you. And so it is my pleasure to introduce Martin Melendro, who is facilitating the Q&A. He was born and raised in Colombia and has lived in the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Lekwungen and Wasanich people since 2015. He's a multidisciplinary engineer with experience on environmental projects in North, Central, and South America. And he's recently taken the executive director role at Yukon Conservation Society. And as he's written here, is excited to continue learning and advocating for healthy ecosystems and sustainable communities. So welcome, Martin. I will turn it over to you, and Sebastian and I look forward to answering some questions.
Thank you, Randy. And thank you, Sebastian. Both presentations were absolutely stellar. I think the recommendations are clear and direct, and the call to action for folks is as well. So I'm excited to write my own letter, and I encourage everyone else to do the same. So from what I can tell, we don't have any questions yet for either of you. I want to remind everyone, though, that both Randy and Sebastian are open to receiving questions later on if they come up. As people read the letter and digest the information, I'm sure they can find your contact information. I want to say in both the YCS and CPAWS websites. So just go to those but I do encourage everyone to use the last 5 minutes we have left for the webinar in case there's anything that is coming to people's minds.
I think
Do you have
Sebastian,
any questions?
enjoying seeing the comments from old colleagues. I see Anne Meese to work for and Deb Donnelly. Yeah. I think we might have lost Martine.
I think so.
Okay, but I see a question coming up, and I also see a hi from Luke. Hi, Luke. Okay, this is from Kim Melton. Thanks so much, Randy, Sebastian, and Martine. What thoughts do you have about the area still set aside for future sub-regional planning? And I suppose there's a few parts of the plan that are set aside for future sub-regional planning. There would be the Yukon River corridor. Can't remember what the name of it is called, but basically the Klondike highway landscape that leads into Dawson, and the Dempster Highway. And Sebastian, do you want to jump in with thoughts about, and it's close to home for you?
Sure. So Randy made a good case for getting a real good jump on the Yukon River corridor to have it designated as a special management area as soon as possible. And there's a lot of merit to that. But one thing that I think about is that the Yukon River actually extends a lot further than just the planning region. It extends all the way up past Whitehorse, all the way from the Alaskan border to the Chilkoot Trail and to the Teslin Lake and beyond. And if the vision of the plan to extend personhood to the Yukon River and to protect it is to come true, then it really needs to be looked after as one piece rather than cutting it up into little pieces. So I have a vision of it as a cultural heritage and natural park managed as a whole throughout the whole Yukon. It would be I can't think of another place in Canada which has a river that's managed quite like that. I think it would be a real feather in our cap if we could do that. So I think that this is a big thing, and I think it makes sense to have some of these things done as sub-regional planning. And a similar thing applies to the highway corridors too, because they do extend outside of the planning region. And we do need to accommodate other interests. So that's my thoughts. It does mean that we would keep on doing this for a little bit longer. I'm assuming that if there is to be sub-regional planning, that it would be a public and open process as well, rather than the sort of thing where it's just between the parties.
Yeah, I think it's one of these things that Sebastian and I are still having lots of conversations on with each other and with lots of people about what the right thing is for the region. And yeah, always open to different thoughts. In terms of the other areas of the plan that are open for sub-regional planning, I don't think planning the area that's around Dawson City later on is the worst idea, because there's a lot going on in that region. And in a way, that level of development needs a finer level of detail than could be accomplished in a regional plan. And I think it would really bog down this process. So in that case, my answer today is that that one would make sense to hold off on.
And there's a couple of other areas where there's decisions that will be made in the future as well. And that's in the areas that are called caribou or overlay areas. So both the wetland overlay areas and the caribou overlay areas, on some of those, there are temporary withdrawals from mineral acquisitions from staking. And so that's a kind of deferral of planning going on in those areas as well.
Thanks both of you for answering that question. I'm sorry I broke out earlier. I have another question, Toshiba. Do the governments have a strategy to tackle the issue of mining claims in areas to be protected?
I think one of their strategies has been trying to avoid them as much as possible, which, as Sebastian mentioned, is not the best way to plan when you're planning a plan that's going to ripple for decades, if not hundreds of years. We really need to be thinking long-term about the region. The Yukon, I think, would hope that claims, I guess, could some of the activity could maybe continue. There is provisions in some of the protected areas for some small amounts of activity to go on or be considered. There's other options. Sometimes people relinquish them and they trade them for other rights in different areas. Or there's an option I think the Yukon government is not really considering, but I think they need to, because like I said, meaningful reconciliation is not always the low-hanging fruit. It can't be. And that there might need to be a buyout of claims. There's no mechanism right now to expropriate claims. Like I said, there have been some that have been relinquished and traded and that kind of thing. But there's other places across Canada and the world where organizations have stepped in to figure out ways to protect areas and buyout claims. There's ways to write policies so some small amount of development can happen. But I'll let you jump in, Sebastian.
I think you covered it. It's the short answer to Sheba is no. There isn't a plan. The new mineral legislation, it does try to address this. My understanding of that is, but we don't have a final way of doing it yet.
And I think that relates to the question from Chris Clark that I'm seeing on the screen. And I don't mean to skip you, Martine. I'm just seeing this connection that what's the rationale being made for the lessening protection for the upper Indian River wetlands? And that's because there are a number of claims in that area. It's not very developed, but there's claims. And there's so many claims that it is not consistent with how Yukon government or other governments around the world would define a protected area. So calling it a protected area doesn't really work, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be protected. It just means that governments need to figure out what to do with the claims. And like we talked about, that could mean, getting rid of them in some way. There's many different options. But there have been so many years of people pushing for the protection of that one section of the watershed that I think it's a time to put a pause on mining in that part.
Yeah, and the provisions for protecting wetlands in that planning area remain. So even though the allowable threshold has been increased from the draft plan, it still has that focus on wetlands. And this speaks to what I was trying to talk about in my presentation, how our society just doesn't contemplate degrowth, rolling things back, healing and recovering the land afterwards. And so that kind of blends into Chris's next question about reclamation of areas. And the discipline of cumulative effects does address that to a certain extent. although that's still under development. It would be, I think, a really good thing if the plan addressed this specifically about how you would be able to roll back disturbed areas and recover them.
Thanks for both of your answers. I am aware of time, but we do have a few more questions. So I don't know if we want to invite people to stay or if we want to answer those questions privately. What do you think, Randy, is the best?
I think if people are keen, they can stick around. If you have to leave, I get it, you have to leave. Maybe there's bedtime that's approaching rapidly at 8 p.m. But I think we can handle a couple more questions, maybe just the one or two that are up.
So good. So we have Luke asking if there's any protection on wetlands across the Yukon. And then Rosanna, how much power does the public have in final decisions?
And I also see there's a question that snuck up on us is in the chat as well from Jim, so we can quickly tackle all three. Luke, protection for the wetlands, not yet. They've been working on a draft or on a wetland policy, a wetland stewardship policy for the territory for years. I was part of kind of this initial drafting team along with there's industry representatives who are part of it, conservation, First Nation representatives. That's taken a long time to get out, and I think it's going to be released soon, but no, this plan is kind of what would be protecting those wetlands now, and it protects some wetlands, but not all. Sebastian, I'm not sure if you have anything to jump in and add.
The plan does talk about designating some wetlands as wetlands of special importance, which is a phrase lifted from the draft wetlands policy, but we don't really know what it means because we haven't seen the final policy yet. Exactly how one would be created or what it would mean to a wetland. So, and I'm quite sure that when the policy comes out, we'll be talking about it in the public as well. Deborah.
I guess thinking about Rosanna's question, was it about the power that the public has, or I can't quite remember how it was phrased?
That's correct. On the final decision, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the public actually has a lot of power. Obviously you can't just wave a magic wand and say, this is how it's going to be, because that doesn't work quite that way. But I just cast your mind back to what happened with the Peel watershed when the Yukon government of the day kind of went rogue on the process. And there was a huge public uprising, and it had a tremendous amount of power. And it made a big difference. Ultimately the decision was decided in the court, but it would never have gotten that far without the voice of the public. So the voice of the public is super important. It really is. Governments, despite what we sometimes think, they actually do listen to people. We see the results of this every day, and if you follow the news. So yes, we do, obviously people like Randy and I, this is what we do for our lives is basically act as voices for the public to try and influence things. And we wouldn't do this if we thought it was hopeless.
That would be depressing. Yeah. Yeah, I think I agree with Sebastian. And I think, of course, we recognize this plan. There's a space for public participation. There's at the same time, there's a government to government relationship between Yukon government and Trondheim, and that's a really important thing. But yeah, Yukon government is meant to be representing the public good. So they do really need to hear from people.
There's a question from Jim Taggart about climate change, and I can quickly address that one if you like, Martin.
Yeah, maybe our last one.
The best way to address climate change in a land use plan is to allow plenty of space for natural processes to evolve and for species to migrate to places where the climate is better suited for them when the climate changes. That's the short answer. And this is why these large area, one of the reasons why these large connected areas are so important. And having, you know, when we have areas that species can't cross across the middle of a protected area, it can really mess things up for adaptation to climate change. Protecting wetlands is another way to make sure that the climate is to reduce the initial impact of the climate as well. Because wetlands store a lot of carbon.
Yeah, and yeah, CPAWS, we will be releasing that report shortly, still finishing up a few odds and ends on carbon storage and peatlands. I was trying to Google it while we were chatting, but I wasn't good enough at Googling and trying to not make a strange face. So I know that Wildlife Conservation Society, I think it was last year, they wrote a really great op-ed in the Yukon News about how to integrate climate change mitigations and adaptation into land use planning. I think there's a few little odds and ends that have made it into this plan. I saw there's a policy to fight fires in priority caribou habitat, because once they lose lichen, it takes about 40 years to grow back. But I agree that there's more that could be done with this plan. Okay, I'll Google it. I'm seeing from Chris Clark asking for it. Okay.
I think with that, Randy, you know, the plan can always be better, but and then I guess that's the point of these recommendations, right? To try to improve it as much as possible with public's input. So thanks again for sharing that link and for answering the questions. I think that covers all of them from what I can see. There's a few thank you messages coming in, but from what I can tell, questions are done. So I guess I'll pass it over to you, Randy, if you want to close the webinar.
Sure, I think I'll just repeat what I've said, and just a really big thank you to everyone who took the time. I think it's such a good feeling to see everyone in this room and people who really care a lot about the region, and there's lots of different perspectives here, and it's a pretty important thing that we're all taking the time to do. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. And if you do have questions, well, you certainly are, it's certainly welcome to send messages to Randy and myself, but you can also contact the Dawson Land Use Planning Commission itself, who've had details about the plan. It's a big document. It's hundreds and hundreds of pages. So it's beyond the scope of any ordinary mortal to be able to just like sit down and read the whole thing and go like, okay, I got it. So if you've got questions, reach out to the Dawson Planning Commission. They have an office in Dawson, or you can reach them at the Yukon Land Use Planning Council in Whitehorse. And they've just put into the chat, please contact us at any time. We love it. Well, they didn't say we love it, but I know they do because I've contacted them several times and they've never told me to be quiet.
And I see, yeah, Nicole Percival is the planner with the Planning Commission, and I see a big smiley face from her, so she agrees with everything you said. So great. Well, I think we will cap it off there. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a good evening and a good rest of your week.